To Operation Epic Fury, President Trump says he is looking for an everlasting deal with Iran, but he says it's tough because their leaders are fighting like cats and dogs.
A gray hull was already nosing toward the throat of the strait when the challenge came over bridge radio, clipped and unmistakable. Alter course, reduce speed, prepare to be boarded. The merchant crew on the Iranian-flagged container ship had less than 7 minutes to decide whether they were a trapped civilian vessel caught in a blockade line, or the spark that could set the entire Gulf on fire. Ahead lay the narrow exit from Hormuz, where the traffic lanes squeeze global energy, naval prestige, and political nerve through a strip of water barely wide enough for error. Astern, American warships had already shifted from shadowing to intercept geometry. Overhead, an F-15 was climbing hard into the dark, racing a countdown no commander in that water wanted to lose. The vessel had entered the eastern approach under commercial declarations, moving west to east with a legal facade and an illegal purpose. In peacetime, an Iranian-flagged ship clearing the strait would be one more radar return among tankers, LNG carriers, and coastal traffic. In a crisis, every mile mattered. The U.S. blockade line had been established after weeks of missile threats, drone overflights, and mine warnings tied to Iranian attempts to choke outbound shipping. Officially, Washington said the barrier was meant to stop sanctioned cargo, weapons movement, and coercive seizure operations hidden inside normal trade. Tehran called it piracy. Shipowners called it a nightmare. Insurers called it a war premium. And every captain entering Hormuz knew the corridor had become a place where the language of international law could vanish behind one wrong turn. That was what made this particular contact so dangerous. The ship was not a fast attack craft or a missile boat. It was bigger, slower, and more politically useful. A container vessel flying an Iranian flag could force the United States into the worst kind of military problem, a target with civilian optics and strategic consequences. If American forces let it breach the outer enforcement ring, the blockade would look hollow. If they used too much force too quickly, Tehran would have its propaganda victory before dawn. Somewhere between those outcomes sat a tiny band of workable decisions, and that band was getting narrower with every minute the ship held course. The Strait of Hormuz does not forgive hesitation. At its tightest span, the waterway compresses traffic into lanes only a few miles across, hemmed in by geography, territorial claims, and constant surveillance. Mountains along Iran's coast create broken radar backgrounds. Small islands interrupt clean sensor lines. Civil shipping moves according to schedule, not military convenience. That means any interception begins with confusion built into the map. A warship cannot simply turn anywhere it wants. A tanker cannot stop on a dime. Helicopters are exposed to shoulder-fired threats close to shore. And jets arriving over water have to sort friend, neutral, and suspect contacts in a battlespace crowded with steel, heat, radio chatter, and legal risk. On the American side, the first warning did not come from dramatic visuals. It came as pattern change. Analysts aboard a U.S. destroyer tracking traffic east of Muscat saw the Iranian-flagged vessel deviate from a declared transit profile, then ignore 2 routing advisories. The ship increased power, not by much, but enough to matter. More importantly, 2 smaller contacts detached from near the Iranian coast and began angling southward. That was classic escort behavior, the kind designed to complicate an interdiction without firing the first obvious shot. A P-8 maritime patrol aircraft already in the region confirmed the geometry. An MQ-9 picked up thermal signatures on the smaller craft consistent with armed crews topside. The destroyer commander now had what mattered most, not certainty, but enough indicators to act before certainty arrived too late. The message chain moved fast. Fifth Fleet watch officers pushed the contact assessment. Lawyers reviewed authorities already delegated under blockade enforcement orders. The answer came back clean enough for action. Hail the vessel. Demand compliance. Position to intercept. Prepare a visit, board, search, and seizure team if the ship refused. And because the escorts raised the prospect of escalation, launch air cover immediately. That last piece explains the title everyone remembers. The F-15 response window was 7 minutes because 7 minutes was the difference between a controlled interception and a layered confrontation close to the lanes. Air crews at a regional base had been sitting armed strip alert for exactly this scenario. The order reached them before the bridge teams in Hormuz had even finished their second warning. Ground crew cleared ladders. Engines spun. The jet rolled heavy with air-to-air missiles, a centerline tank, and the authority to dominate the sky without firing unless something went badly wrong. Its mission was brutally simple. Get overhead fast enough to make every armed boat captain below understand that the next move would be seen, recorded, and if necessary punished. At sea, the destroyer drove in at flank speed. A cruiser farther south adjusted to close the outer arc. A second U.S. ship did not need to be on top of the contact to matter. In naval interception, position can threaten before weapons ever speak. Meanwhile, the Iranian-flagged vessel kept pushing toward the breach point. Its master answered the radio with technical language about innocent passage, mechanical delay, and rights of transit. It sounded plausible right up until the ship refused to slow. Then came the sharper challenge from the U.S. bridge. You are approaching a restricted maritime control zone. Alter to 090 immediately. Prepare to heave to, acknowledge now. The acknowledgement never came. This is the part most viewers imagine as pure force, but real military pressure is often built from sequence.
First comes presence, then classification, then clear warning, then positioning,
then a visible capability no one can mistake. The Americans were still inside that ladder. No one wanted to skip to gunfire. Boarding a steel commercial ship in confined water is already dangerous. Doing it while armed escorts circle nearby, with coastal missile batteries somewhere beyond the horizon, is how regional crises stop being regional. The vessel's defenders understood that too. One escort boat surged ahead and crossed outside the merchant ship's bow, throwing spray and trying to create a shield of chaos. Another held off the port quarter, close enough to suggest it might interfere with any boarding approach. The destroyer's combat information center marked both as hostile leaning but not yet weapons-free.
range collapsed.
Voices on military circuits shortened. Commanders stopped discussing what the Iranians might intend and started discussing what they could physically do in the next 3 minutes. Then the F-15 checked in. Its arrival changed the whole temperature of the fight. From altitude, the pilot had what the ships did not, a clean top-down picture. The jet's radar and targeting pod could sort contacts through the clutter, track the escorts, and feed confirmation back into the network. Even without releasing a weapon, a fast mover overhead imposes a form of pressure surface crews understand instinctively. They know they can be watched continuously. They know sudden acceleration, weapons handling, or radar activation will be seen. They know they are no longer dealing only with a destroyer's horizon-limited view. In a waterway where seconds disappear inside sea spray and radio lag, that matters. The pilot made a low, legal, unmistakable pass offset from the ship's beam, not close enough to count as reckless, but close enough that every man on deck felt the shock of afterburner in his chest. The escorts broke formation for a moment. That was the first American win.
Not a shot. Not a collision.
A moment of decision stolen from the other side. The destroyer used it. Its captain pushed ahead into a blocking angle that forced the container vessel to choose between compliance and an obvious ramming trajectory no commercial master could credibly defend afterward. Over bridge radio came the final warning. You will come to all engines stop.
You will prepare to be boarded.
Any interference by associated armed craft will be treated as hostile intent. On another frequency, the boarding team leader was already reciting checklists from memory: helmets on, weapons low, ladders ready, medics briefed, translator assigned. The Iranian-flagged ship still did not stop. Now the tactical logic tightened. The Americans could not allow a blockade breach because enforcement collapses the second one defiant vessel proves the line is symbolic. They also could not sink or catastrophically damage a merchant ship in a crowded global chokepoint unless every other option had been exhausted in public and on tape. So they used the intermediate tools navies practice for years and pray never to improvise. The destroyer fired warning flares first. The F-15 rolled wide and stayed present. A rigid hull boat carrying the boarding team launched from the shadow of the warship, using the merchant hull itself to mask part of its approach from the escorts. The second American ship announced over open channel that additional coalition assets were converging. Whether they were minutes away or not almost did not matter. The signal was strategic. This contact was no longer isolated. One escort boat tried to press in anyway. That finally crossed the threshold. The destroyer trained a deck gun and painted the craft with fire control quality tracking.
No shot needed.
A naval gun aimed with intent is its own sentence.
The boat sheared away.
The other escort fell back toward the northern side of the lane, careful now, still menacing, but no longer committed. That left the merchant vessel alone under the pressure that had been building since the first call-out. Slow steel cannot bluff forever.
Its wake flattened.
Its bow began to drift off the escape line. The engine note dropped. On the destroyer's displays, speed bled down knot by knot. The captain waited until the number was low enough to trust, then gave the order.
Board.
The RHIB came in hard over dark water, slamming through the wake and rising beneath the wall of painted steel.
Hook ladders flew.
The first sailors climbed under the worst conditions boarding teams face, not in open combat, not in calm inspection, but in that ugly middle ground where one armed man above can turn procedure into blood in seconds. They gained the rail fast. Security split. One element drove for bridge control. Another locked down key access points. The translator started shouting instructions the crew had heard on radio but clearly hoped to outlast. Hands visible. Stay where you are. Do not touch communications equipment. Do not move toward engineering spaces. There was resistance, but it was the kind that reveals weakness. Not a firefight. Not a last stand. Delays. Arguments. A closed hatch where an open one should have been. A crewman reaching for a handset and thinking better of it when he saw a rifle already covering the move. The bridge was secured in less than a minute. Engine control was confirmed. The ship's manifest was seized. One American sailor cut the flag halyard and another secured the mast area for evidence photography. A civilian master trying to play for time had become the captain of a detained vessel. The F-15 remained overhead because the boarding was only half the problem. Taking a ship is one action. Holding the sea around it is another. Coastal anti-ship missiles, drones, swarming boats, even a politically staged collision could still convert a clean seizure into a propaganda ambush. The destroyer expanded its surface screen. The P-8 pushed farther north with radar sweeping for reinforcements. Electronic warfare teams watched for targeting emissions from shore. For a tense stretch of minutes, everyone involved knew the most dangerous phase was not the approach. It was the aftermath, when the side that had just lost the initiative might try to grab it back with something louder. Nothing came. That silence mattered as much as the seizure itself. It suggested Tehran had pushed a test case, not a full naval engagement. The ship had likely been meant to puncture the blockade politically, force a standoff on camera, and either slip through or trigger an American overreaction. Instead, it had been stopped with a chain of force calibrated almost perfectly: detect, warn, position, isolate, dominate, board, secure. The jet did not need to fire. The destroyer did not need to disable the hull. The escorts were outplayed without creating a martyrship for Iranian media by sunrise. Once the immediate danger eased, the operation shifted from combat posture to controlled exploitation. Boarding officers verified cargo spaces against transmitted declarations. Communications gear was examined for signs the vessel had been coordinating with military escorts before entry. Navigation records were copied. Crew identities were checked against sanctions and intelligence watch lists. Any container ship can hide more than cargo. Documents tell one story. Routing data tells another. Who called whom before the boarding often tells the truth. The strategic meaning widened by the hour. The Strait of Hormuz handles a massive share of the world's seaborne energy flow. Every crisis there ripples far beyond the Gulf. Traders watch it through oil futures. Insurance firms watch it through risk models. Regional governments watch it through the old question that never really disappears: when pressure comes, who can still keep the lanes open? That is why a single vessel matters. In a choke point, credibility moves in ship-sized pieces. One successful breach invites imitation. One clean interception restores deterrence, at least for a while. For the United States, the seizure sent 3 messages at once. To Iran, that blockade enforcement would not remain a press statement once challenged. To commercial shipping, that response time was measured in minutes, not diplomatic cycles. And to allies uneasy about escalation, that Washington still preferred controlled force over spectacular violence. Those distinctions matter in maritime crises. The side that looks most disciplined often gains the broadest support, even from states that dislike both players. For Iran, the lesson was harsher. Gray zone pressure works best below the threshold of decisive response. Fast boats can harass. Drones can signal. Legal arguments can muddy water. But once a sanctioned or state-backed ship becomes the instrument of a visible blockade breach, it risks forcing the opponent into a simple yes or no test. On this night, the Americans answered yes. Yes, they would stop it. Yes, they would board it. Yes, they would bring tactical air into the stack before the escorts could turn theater into leverage. None of that means Hormuz became safe. Safe is the wrong word for a corridor where mountain shadows, territorial boundaries, crowded shipping, and military ambition overlap every day. The next crisis could look different. Mines instead of escorts. Drones instead of deck guns. A tanker under foreign flag instead of an Iranian one. A fog of deniability thicker than anything seen here. That is the nature of choke points. They are never won once. They are managed repeatedly under pressure. Still on that night, one fact stood above the rest. A vessel trying to punch through a blockade at the world's most dangerous maritime bottleneck discovered that distance in Hormuz is measured less in miles than in response time. 7 minutes for the fighter. A few more for the warship to close. One boarding window. One miscalculation. And the entire operation reversed. By dawn, the seized ship was no longer a symbol of defiance heading for open water. It was an escorted prize under American control, its bridge quiet, its crew contained, its path rewritten by force applied just short of chaos. The escorts had vanished back toward the coast. Civil traffic resumed its cautious rhythm. Radar screens filled again with the ordinary commerce that keeps the modern world supplied and vulnerable at the same time. In command centers far from the spray, analysts were replaying the contact second by second. How early had the deviation become obvious? Which radio calls had been ignored? How close had the escorts come before the threshold shifted from posturing to interference? Those questions were not academic. The next captain through the strait would inherit the answer. So would every Iranian planner studying the tapes. Maritime deterrence is built from memory as much as firepower. Crews remember who arrived, how fast, and whether warnings turned into action. That memory travels from bridge to bridge long after headlines fade, and in a place like Hormuz, remembered speed can prevent the next confrontation before the warning is ever transmitted. That is the real power of a fast military response.
Not noise. Not spectacle.
The ability to take a moment that could have become a regional firefight and compress it into a clear outcome before the wider war arrives. In Hormuz, that margin is never generous. It belongs to the side that sees first, moves first, and holds its nerve longest. And on this night, 7 minutes was all the United States needed.